Welcome to the Lindamood-Bell Leaders in Literacy webinar. My name is Dave Kivita. I'm the Director of Development for Lindamood-Bell for Schools, and I appreciate you joining us today. I'm going to be the host of the webinar, and I'm going to be talking with a great friend and work colleague, Barbara Wilmarth from Pinellas County Schools. And really appreciate you taking the time out, Barbara, to come and join us today and talk a little bit about your experience, which is pretty vast in providing reading instruction to special education students. And I think folks will learn a lot from your thinking on what the evolution is that you've seen from when you first started teaching reading with special education students all the way up until today. And so really happy to have you here, and maybe we can start with just you sort of introducing yourself, talking a little bit about Pinellas County and your specific role.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Dave. I am Barbara Wilmarth, and I'm an instructional staff developer around the needs of students with disabilities here in Pinellas County, where we are a large urban district. So we have roughly 1,000 students right now, and about 14,000 of those students are identified as students with disabilities. Part of the reason that percentage is high is that our district provides so many supports that it attracts families to our district for that support. We have about 150 schools, and that makes it a challenge to make change because you have to have a broad reach across so many educators to reach such a large number of children.
Yeah. And you said, I think when we started there, I appreciate that background. Initially, it sounded like you said 1,000 students, but I think it was 100,000 students. Is that right?
Yes, 100,000 students.
Great. And so, as an instructional staff developer, can you talk a little bit about what your specific range of responsibility is and how you support the county?
So I'm a member of the elementary team, and I serve directly 17 of our 78 elementary schools by providing side-by-side coaching for the administration, the teachers, and often the associates as well. I also put on a lot of larger professional development for targeted groups or open to anyone who's interested in learning about how to serve students with reading difficulties.
Great. Fantastic. And you've been in Pinellas County for a while now, and obviously this is a role that you sort of gradually worked your way toward. And when you first began your role in Pinellas County, maybe you can talk a little bit about first, when that was, and then maybe what the instruction was like that you were expected to deliver to students.
Well, and actually I started teaching a few years before I came to Pinellas. And when I first started teaching in 1982, it was the time of precision teaching. So there were just pages and pages of words and facts and things that kids practiced drill, rote memory pieces. When I moved to Pinellas in 1987, everyone who was a teacher for students with disabilities was expected to teach through direct instruction methods. And so that was literally putting an easel between the teacher and the group of students, and the teacher is reading from a script. The students are all responding to the same stimulus at the same time, chorally, and that was very difficult for me because I wanted to be able to design my lessons and respond to my students and teach them where they needed to be. And that learning, that instructional method didn't allow for that. So I stepped outside that directed box and started making some choices for my students. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, and earlier when we were talking, you were talking a little bit about how that group of students was constituted. And we talk a lot nowadays about differentiated instruction. Was there any differentiation? It sounds like there wasn't any differentiation in the instruction. How about in terms of the population of the students? What did that look like?
Well, it was just anyone who was identified as having a reading disability. So in some places it was kids with actual IEPs. In other places it was just low performing kids. But again, everybody, same page, same response, same time. And what I found when I was implementing this method is through the course of the year, kids would advance across that one level, and then they would return the next year and test back into the beginning of that level that they had gone through the previous year. So it wasn't finding it to develop any long-term improvement for the students.
Yeah. And so often when we think about reading instruction, that's a lot of times, well, we know now that there's a difference in reading between the ability to decode and figure out what the individual words say, and then there's the ability to put all of those words together so that you can derive meaning from them. Was there any sort of real reading comprehension instruction that was happening during that process?
Not with the direct instruction, but with the next evolution, as we moved into reciprocal teaching, kids were now going to be exposed to real books. And while there were recommended books, teachers had some choice in what books to use with groups. But with reciprocal teaching, the focus was more on making the students responsible for learning and not that true comprehension of concept imagery. Just still very low-level questioning and not building a true understanding of what they've read.
Got it. Great. And so that's kind of what you initially came into. You were saying you stepped out of the box a little bit, and in the field of education as a whole, a couple of different developments started to happen. So maybe you can walk us through a little bit of what some more aspects of that evolution look like.
So with the report of Blueprint 2000, it became worldwide knowledge that only 60% of American students could read. And so a lot of attention came to the fact that we needed to change instruction to meet the needs of more students. And that was really the birth of the guided reading movement. So you would think that now we have differentiation because we're going to look at what reading level the kids are at. We're going to group them by these reading levels and teach. But the guided reading lesson plans were still finite. Everybody was expected to do this many minutes of this and this many minutes of that. And so it really, while we grouped kids at their level, we weren't looking at individual needs yet for kids.
Got it. Got it. And then Common Core really came in to play and sort of set the stage for how students were supposed to be instructed and what they were supposed to be instructed on across the country. How did that impact special education students and their reading instruction?
You know, Common Core in entirety is not a bad thing. It's the interpretation and practice that we've put in place, at least in the districts that I'm familiar with, that has presented the problem. Because administrators, leaders of teachers, leaders of districts have locked into those high yield standards, that rigor, the idea that everybody needs to be at that 5th grade level text on the same day at the same time with the same task to show their performance. And they've forgotten that Common Core included foundational standards and listening and speaking standards and other things that would help us to close gaps for students. And
Right.
so part of our work as ESE teachers is to try to find the time to close gaps with foundational standards. And it's challenging because not everyone understands that you have to meet kids where they're at.
Right, right. So back to sort of a lack of differentiation again. And sort of as we've continued forward, now we're at a point where a lot of folks are talking about the science of reading, and there is so much more of an understanding of what the necessary components of being a complete reader are, and there's lots of research that's being done on that. How are you seeing that science of reading discussion impacting your ESE implementation?
Well, we really are trying to support all of our teachers in looking closely at diagnostic data, not just those big sweeping state tests, but small pieces, even your anecdotal notes while you're teaching that let you know exactly where your kid is and what is the next step for that individual student. And even when you're sitting with a group of 4 or 5 kids in front of you, how you can use what you know about each one of those learners and respond to what that student's response is, respond to what their needs are in questioning them to better fluency and comprehension in their reading.
Got it. And when we were getting ready to sort of preparing for this presentation, you were telling me about, I was asking questions about how you'd first heard about Lindamood-Bell, and you were describing one day that your supervisor had brought you in and given you a bunch of different brochures of different programs and told you to kind of pick one and we'll go with it. And you chose Lindamood-Bell. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what your process of thinking about that was, what you saw as being the differentiators in the program, and even as you went into implementing the program, what did you see that was different about the Lindamood-Bell programs as compared with programs that you've been doing previously?
Okay, so it was interesting because I was school-based at that time, and then, as you said, I was asked to look at these different companies that provided solutions for students with difficulty learning to read. And one of the things that really stood out for me with Lindamood-Bell was that it covered the whole gamut of skills. So all the way from initial phonemic awareness and phonics through decoding and reading and fluency, but also comprehension. I did not find another group that was able to provide those things that we needed for kids with dyslexic-like characteristics, those things we needed for kids with hyperlexic-like characteristics, as well as those kids with mixed reading difficulties. And the other thing that made it easy for us here in Pinellas to launch our first project was that Lindamood-Bell was already endorsed by the Florida Center for Reading Research. And so, I had that piece to stand on as well.
Yeah, great. And as you went in and implemented the programs, you sort of obviously got trained and went through an initial training with a large cohort of folks. And then you went out and began to implement the programs. You've talked a lot about how your development was really guided and helped by the fact that you had somebody there that was working directly with you.
Yeah, I was very fortunate as an instructional staff developer to be given the opportunity to work with students every single day. And so I really think when you're trying to change your practice, it's important that you practice, right? So I had the opportunity for an entire school year to work with multiple groups of kids while having side-by-side coaching from a Lindamood-Bell coach. And so it was that opportunity for both of us to have eyes on the responses of our students and the information we knew about our students at the same time. and to talk about that and to make instructional decisions that, we could build our own automaticity with. So
Right.
you learn to respond in the moment to exactly what that student needs. And that's the most wonderful thing about the way Lindamood-Bell uses Socratic questioning throughout all of the strategies that you share with us.
Yeah, and I think you and we'll take a look at some data from that initial partnership in a moment. But I do think one of the things I hear when I talk to districts, some of the frustration is that coaches don't have that opportunity to really go out and practice with students. And so they learn something and then they're supposed to go and coach other folks in it. And yet they haven't really had that experience of sitting down and taking someone through the entire course of a kind of a scope and sequence of a program. So I did want to take a look at some data from our initial partnership with Pinellas County. And this is from a group of Tier 3 students. And they received about, on average, so they were 6th graders, they received on average about 143 hours of instruction, a small group intervention, which is a lot. And they were delivered a battery of assessments both before they began instruction, and that allowed you guys to group those students as sort of homogenously as possible, and then they were post-tested so you could measure that. And the battery is sort of laid out there, and obviously you're very familiar with the battery, Barbara, so I don't have to talk in much detail with you about it. But for folks looking at it, we're measuring all of the different parts, the component parts of reading, leading over to improvements in fluency and comprehension. And so, Barbara, can you talk a little bit about how these students were seen and what that looked like? And I think folks would be particularly interested in figuring out how it was that they managed to get 143 hours of intervention.
Yeah. At that time, one of our middle schools who chose to implement the Seeing Stars with a group of students, they looked at their incoming 6th graders and they determined the lowest performing readers. So those kids, some of them might have had IEPs, but not all of them did. They were looking at how can I take these kids with the lowest reading performance scores and teach them to read. So these kids were divided into 3 different classes. And in that time, our secondary reading intervention was a 2-period block. So these kiddos had 84 minutes a day in essentially a 1 to 5 model, because they had a teacher and an associate trained to work in that classroom. So that's where we got all that intensity from. And we saw, significant gains in what we were teaching with the Seeing Stars, right? So word attack, accuracy, all of that is shown in the scores here. But I do like to call attention to the fact that these kids had mixed reading difficulties. They were really performing like their scores were the lowest that you could get. And so many of them went on the next year to get some more practice with fluency, but also in the VV program to develop that vocabulary and comprehension. Because you get to a point you learn to read words that you don't know what the words are.
Right. Yeah, and it really does come to that whole language processing spectrum, ranging from that ability to decode for students who are doing Seeing Stars, and then comprehension being addressed in the visualizing and verbalizing program. And I wanted to take a look at one more group of students, because this was Tier 3 kids. But then we also saw some really impressive gains with Tier 2 students who weren't getting, obviously, 84 minutes a day because they were in a much less rigid situation. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about these students.
Yes, these kids, some of them were seen by teachers for their intervention, some by associates, but all of those had been trained in using the Seeing Stars program. And so the intervention block at that time was the kind of walk to read model, right? So every grade level has their 30-minute block, and kids are grouped for what intervention would be best for them, and then they walk to that group and receive that intervention, generally 5 days a week, but not always.
Yeah, yeah, and it's great to see that even in a half-hour model. And so when folks are looking at this chart, the little asterisk denotes that those are statistically significant changes for students, and then the size or the significance of those changes is on the left-hand side with the standard score changes for all of those parts.
So we saw great games.
Yeah, yeah, those are great. Okay, and so that kind of talks a little bit about our initial partnership, and I think that partnership, when we were first working together, had some really fantastic aspects to it. There were also some challenges to it. Maybe you could talk a little bit about both of those aspects.
Well, having coaching from the company and having training from the developer of the strategies are essential to being successful. We were fortunate enough to have all of that. The challenge then became many of those who were developed by that coaching model were classroom teachers, and they're still classroom teachers today. So building that coaching across your district where you have the opportunity to teachers grow other teachers is a very difficult model for anyone, but in a district our size, with 150 different schools, it is a bigger challenge, I think.
Yeah. And so one of the exciting things is that we're really partnering together now to try to structure ways to really intensively see students at what's called the Center for Literacy Innovation, which I know that you were heavily involved in kind of the startup of that. And it's at Elisa Nelson Elementary in Pinellas. Maybe you can talk about what the genesis of the Center for Literacy is and what sort of vision that the district and folks within the district have for it, and what sort of hopes and dreams you've got for it as well.
Thank you. Yes, I'm not involved with their day-to-day work that they do now. In order to bring our district in compliance with current legislation around the needs of students with dyslexic-like characteristics, I have to be thankful for my district leadership trying to be proactive, and we are ahead of any other large local in Florida, probably any school district in Florida, by creating a screening for dyslexic-like characteristics and establishing a center where parents could apply to bring their child and have them screened, and then have their students attend a school that would focus on closing gaps for their students. So when the kids are at school, the strategies of symbol imagery and concept imagery are embedded in their entire school day. Yes, they have small group instruction. They have direct, systematic development of the strategies that they need, but those same strategies are embedded throughout their school day. Yeah. And that hopefully will allow them to become fluent readers in a shorter period of time.
Yeah, yeah. And we were talking earlier about how these the students in the data sets that we looked at previously had real mixed challenges in terms of their reading areas. And obviously the Center for Literacy Innovation was specifically focused on trying to figure out who are the students with characteristics or dyslexia-like characteristics. And so when we take a look at that same battery of assessments, but we now look at that, and so far this year we've only got the pretest scores for these students because we haven't completed the school year yet. So that'll be exciting to see. But when we look at this battery of assessments for these particular kids, what stands out about that?
Well, first of all, it validates to me that the screening pieces that we used are validated by the assessment pieces that you use. So we really did identify kids with dyslexic-like characteristics. And what stands out there is that vocabulary score.
Yeah.
So these students need to learn that phonemic awareness, phonics, that response with automaticity to words, and that symbol imagery,
right,
where their vocabulary is there. So once we close one gap, hopefully we won't have another one to close.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, when we were talking about those previous groups of students, some of those students were scoring around the 10th percentile in terms of their vocabulary, as well as many of their other measures. And so, yeah, as you pointed out, their vocabulary coming at the 66th percentile is a clear indication that vocabulary and probably oral language comprehension is not an issue for them. The struggles around reading are really about issues of the component parts of decoding. Well, Barbara, I wanted to say very much a big thank you for joining us and taking some time out to talk a bit about what your experience in Pinellas and your experience in the field of education has been like. And for folks who've got questions out there, Barbara's contact information is listed down at the bottom of this slide. My contact information is listed there as well. We'd love to have you all join us for additional Leaders in Literacy webinars, which come periodically through the year. And we also have podcasts available, all of which you can find by stopping by the Lindamood-Bell website or by emailing us, and we can get you a little bit of that previous webinars and other podcasts that you can listen to. Thanks again, Barbara, for taking the time out. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.